He kept my name on the paperwork. That was his mistake. By the time his lawyer slid the buyout offer across the table, I had already filed the documents that would bury him. Daniel and I met during our junior year at Howard. He was the kind of person who remembered your coffee order after hearing it once, who showed up at your apartment with takeout when you mentioned in passing that your week had been rough. We stayed close after graduation, the kind of close where you stop counting favors because the ledger doesn't matter anymore. When I came into a modest inheritance after my grandmother passed, $240,000, the sum total of a woman's lifetime of careful saving. Daniel was the one who sat with me at the kitchen table and said we should build something with it. Not spend it, build. He had the operations mind, the eye for routing and logistics, the way of talking to warehouse managers like he'd known them for years. I had the capital, the business degree, and a last name that opened doors in our city's small but tight shipping community. My grandmother had run a courier service for 30 years. People knew the name Odom, so we filed the LLC together, split it 50-50 on paper, and launched Odom Price Logistics out of a rented office on Vine Street. The first year was beautiful. We landed 3 regional contracts within 8 months. Daniel handled the day-to-day while I managed the finances and client relationships we'd inherited from my grandmother's old network. He was good at what he did. I never once questioned that. What I should have questioned was why he started taking meetings I wasn't invited to. It began with small things. A vendor I'd never heard of appearing on our expense reports. Daniel explaining it away as a better rate he'd negotiated while I was at a conference. Then the client calls started going to a cell phone instead of our office line. He said it was more efficient, that people preferred reaching a person directly. I believed him because I had no framework for not believing Daniel. He was family to me. Not like family. Family. The first real crack came 18 months into the business. When I called one of our oldest clients, a regional grocery chain my grandmother had personally serviced for a decade, and the receptionist said they'd been told to direct all communication to Daniel Price. I laughed. I actually laughed because it sounded like a clerical mistake. I texted Daniel about it and he responded with a thumbs up emoji and said he'd sort it out. He never sorted it out. 2 weeks later, I pulled our vendor files and found that 11 of our 14 active contracts had been amended. The point of contact on every single one had been changed from Odom Price Logistics to Daniel Price, operating as, not our company name, his name. The amendments were dated over a span of 9 months, meaning he had been doing this methodically, quietly, while sitting across from me at our shared desk and asking if I wanted anything from the deli downstairs. I drove to the office that night after he'd left and opened the filing cabinet we kept in the back room. Half the folders were gone. The ones that remained had been copied, but the originals, the ones with my signature, with our original terms, with the Odom name printed at the top, had been removed. I sat on the floor of that office for a long time. I remember the sound the fluorescent lights made, that faint electrical hum, and how it filled the silence while I tried to understand what I was looking at. 3 days later, Daniel asked me to meet him at a coffee shop downtown. Not our office, a coffee shop. He brought a lawyer, a man I'd never seen before, wearing a tie that cost more than our first month's rent. Daniel sat across from me with that same easy warmth in his eyes and told me the business had outgrown our original arrangement. He said he'd been carrying the operational load and that it was time to restructure. His lawyer slid a single sheet of paper across the table. A buyout offer. $40,000 for my share of a company I had funded, with $240,000 of my dead grandmother's money, built on contracts that bore her name, launched from relationships she had spent 3 decades cultivating. $40,000 and a handshake. Daniel actually reached his hand across the table while the offer sat between us. He said he hoped we could still be friends. I looked at his hand, I looked at the paper, I looked at the lawyer who wouldn't meet my eyes. And something inside me didn't break. It rearranged. I went home that night and I did not cry. I sat at my kitchen table with a glass of water I never drank, and I thought about the way he'd reached his hand across that table, the warmth in his eyes, how practiced it was, how long it must have been practiced. Then I opened my laptop. I pulled up every digital record I had, every email, every filing, every receipt. And I found what I was looking for within 20 minutes. Because Daniel, for all his careful maneuvering, had made one fundamental error. He had spent 2 years transferring relationships, redirecting clients, and building a shadow version of our company under his own name. But he had never filed an amendment to the LLC. The original operating agreement listed me as managing member with 50% ownership. My name was on the articles of organization filed with the state. My name was on the EIN registration. My name was, in the eyes of every legal and financial institution that mattered, the first name on the door. Daniel had been so focused on stealing the muscle of the business that he forgot the skeleton still belonged to me. I did not confront him. I hired my own attorney the next morning. The first move was quiet. My attorney sent a formal notice to every vendor and client Daniel had redirected, informing them that Odom Price Logistics was the sole authorized entity for all existing contracts, that Daniel Price had no independent authority to amend terms, and that any future correspondence should be directed to me as managing member. I CC'd our bank, I CC'd our insurance carrier, I CC'd the state licensing board. The second move was sharper. I filed a petition with the court for an emergency order freezing the company's accounts pending a review of fiduciary duty. Because Daniel was a 50% member operating under our LLC, every contract he'd redirected, every payment he'd funneled, every vendor relationship he'd claimed as personal was, legally, company property. Property he had been converting for personal use without the consent of his co-owner. My attorney called it what it was: breach of fiduciary duty, self-dealing, and unauthorized conversion of company assets. Daniel found out about the vendor notices first. He called me 17 times in one afternoon. I didn't answer. He found out about the account freeze the next morning when he tried to pay a driver and his card was declined. He showed up at my apartment that evening looking like he hadn't slept. He said I was overreacting. He said this was going to hurt both of us. I told him I'd see him in mediation and closed the door. What he still didn't know was that I hadn't played my final card yet. The third move was the one that ended it. I had my attorney subpoena Daniel's personal bank records as part of the fiduciary review. And there it was, spread across 18 months of statements, deposits from our clients made directly into his personal account, not the company account. His. Over $300,000 in diverted revenue. Revenue generated by contracts that originated under the Odom Price name, serviced by drivers paid with company funds, insured under our company policy. He hadn't just been stealing relationships. He'd been stealing money. And because the LLC was intact, because my name was still on every foundational document, every dollar he'd taken was legally traceable back to company property. My attorney filed the amended complaint on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Daniel's own lawyer had withdrawn from representation. I heard later that the lawyer hadn't known about the diverted funds and dropped Daniel the moment the bank records surfaced. The mediation session happened 3 weeks later in a windowless conference room downtown. Daniel sat across from me with no attorney, wearing a shirt I recognized from college, and for one terrible second, I saw the person I used to know. Then his eyes shifted and he started talking about how I owed him for the sweat equity, for the years he'd spent building something while I just signed checks. The mediator asked him to explain the $300,000 in his personal account. He couldn't. He stammered through something about operational expenses and verbal agreements. The mediator asked him to produce documentation of those agreements. He had none, because they didn't exist. The final order came down 6 weeks later. Full restitution of diverted funds. Daniel was removed as a member of the LLC, He was barred from contacting our clients or vendors for 18 months under a non-solicitation clause. The contracts he'd spent 2 years quietly stealing were returned to the company, my company, in a single afternoon of updated paperwork. I sat in my attorney's office and signed document after document, and with each signature, I watched Daniel's careful, patient theft dissolve back into nothing. He tried to start his own logistics company 4 months later. It lasted 11 weeks. It turns out that when every vendor and client in a mid-sized market gets a certified letter explaining that your last business partner had to sue you for embezzlement, people become reluctant to hand you their shipping contracts. I run Odom Logistics now. Dropped the price. The office on Vine Street is still there, though we've expanded into the suite next door. My grandmother's name is on the window in gold letters the way it should have been from the start. Some nights I drive past Daniel's old apartment on my way home. The lights are always off now. I don't feel what I expected to feel. There's no satisfaction. Not really. There's just the quiet fact of a thing that was taken and then recovered, and the weight of knowing that the person who took it was someone I would have given it to if he'd only asked. I keep the original LLC paperwork in my grandmother's filing cabinet, not because I need it anymore, because it reminds me that owning something and controlling it are not the same thing, and the person who forgets that will always lose to the person who doesn't.